Modesto, California was alive with the spirit of Christmas. The air was crisp, the streets adorned with glittering lights, and neighbors exchanged cheerful greetings as they passed each other. Inside the Peterson home, Laci Peterson bustled about, her radiant smile lighting up the room as she carefully placed ornaments on the Christmas tree. She hummed softly to herself, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. Her son, Connor, was due in just a few weeks, and her excitement for his arrival was evident in every little detail of her preparations. "Scott," she called out, her voice carrying a cheerful lilt, "could you help me hang this garland over the fireplace?" She paused, glancing toward the other room where her husband was seated, seemingly preoccupied with his phone. Scott Peterson looked up briefly, his smile polite but distant. "Sure, give me a minute," he replied, slipping his phone into his pocket. The screen had displayed a name, Amber Frey. His demeanor remained calm, but an undercurrent of tension lingered in his movements. Unaware of Scott's distraction, Laci continued decorating. "This is going to be the best Christmas ever," she said to herself. She couldn't wait to host her family, to share a festive meal, and to celebrate the joys of the season. She had already planned everything down to the smallest detail, the table settings, the menu, even a playlist of her favorite holiday songs. Later that evening, Sharon Rocha stopped by to drop off a few gifts. "Laci, you've outdone yourself again," Sharon said warmly as she took in the cozy ambience of the home. "And look at you, glowing as always." Laci laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thanks, Mom. I just want everything to be perfect for Connor's first Christmas, even if he's not here to see it yet." The two women exchanged a knowing smile, their bond evident in the easy way they talked. Scott, however, stood at the edge of the room, his presence quiet and almost ghostly. Sharon gave him a warm nod, but his responses were minimal, a stark contrast to Laci's animated excitement. As the evening wore on, Scott excused himself to the garage, claiming he needed to check on something. Laci barely noticed his absence, her mind too full of holiday joy and anticipation for the future. In the garage, Scott leaned against the workbench, staring blankly at a set of fishing gear he hadn't used in months. His mind raced, thoughts tangled in a web of lies and decisions he had made but wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Laci woke early, her enthusiasm undiminished. She made a list of errands, reminding herself to walk Mackenzie, their golden retriever, before heading out. Scott remained in bed, his face turned away from her. She kissed his cheek lightly, unaware of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. As she stepped outside, the sun bathed the neighborhood in a soft glow, and Mackenzie wagged his tail eagerly. Laci didn't know that this morning, filled with routine and simple pleasures, would be the last she'd ever experience. The cheerful facade of the Peterson home was about to shatter, leaving behind questions and grief that would ripple far beyond Modesto. The morning of December 24th, 2002, began like any other in the Peterson household. Laci woke early, slipping out of bed while Scott remained under the covers, facing away from her. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, a checklist already forming in her mind. There was so much to do, errands to run, the dog to walk, and last-minute touches to prepare for Christmas dinner. Mackenzie's eager bark greeted her as she approached the back door. "Okay, boy, let's go for that walk," she said with a smile, clipping the leash to his collar. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who loved her simple routines. Outside, the neighborhood was still waking up, and the soft morning sun painted everything in a golden hue. It was peaceful, serene, a stark contrast to what would soon follow. Scott finally stirred, rolling over and checking his phone. Amber Frey's name lit up the screen from a missed call the night before. He stared at it for a long moment before shoving the phone back onto the nightstand. Rising from bed, he moved with the detached efficiency of someone with too much on his mind. Heading to the garage, he fiddled with his fishing gear, arranging it with meticulous care. His plan for the day, a fishing trip at Berkeley Marina, was his alibi, rehearsed and ready to use. Meanwhile, Sharon Rocha called Laci to confirm dinner plans. Laci picked up on the second ring, her cheerful voice filling the line. "Mom, I can't wait for you to try the dessert I made. Scott loved it." "Well, I think he did," she joked. Sharon chuckled, reassured by her daughter's lightheartedness. "Just don't overdo it, Laci," Sharon replied. "You need to rest before the baby comes." By mid-morning, Scott loaded his boat into the truck, glancing back at the house as he did so. Laci's car was still in the driveway, a sign she hadn't yet left for her errands. Mackenzie was quiet now, his walk likely finished. Scott hesitated briefly, then climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He pulled out of the driveway without a word. Laci's plans for the day seemed simple enough. A trip to the grocery store, a stop at the bakery, and delivering gifts to her sister-in-law. But as the hours passed, Sharon noticed something troubling. Laci wasn't answering her phone. Calls went straight to voicemail, an unusual occurrence for her daughter. Sharon's concern grew into unease when she drove by the house later that afternoon and saw Mackenzie pacing outside, still tethered to his leash. "Scott," Sharon called after finally reaching him on his cell. "Where's Laci? She hasn't called me back." His response was measured, almost mechanical. "I don't know. I went fishing this morning, and when I got back, she wasn't here." The unease turned to alarm. Sharon didn't waste a moment. She called the police, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. "My daughter is 8 months pregnant. She would never just leave without saying something. Something is wrong. I know it." As officers arrived and began their initial search, they noted the peculiar calmness in Scott's demeanor. While Sharon frantically described Laci's plans for the day, Scott offered little detail, repeating only that he'd been fishing. His gaze was distant, his tone detached. Outside, the Peterson home was bathed in the soft glow of Christmas lights, but the festive scene now felt hollow. The once ordinary day had shifted irrevocably, leaving behind an unsettling void. Laci was gone, and in her absence, questions loomed like shadows in the fading light. The news of Laci Peterson's disappearance spread rapidly across Modesto. What had started as a quiet Christmas Eve had turned into a nightmare for her family and a mystery for the small, tight-knit community. Sharon Rocha's urgent plea to the police was the spark that ignited a massive search effort. Officers combed through the Peterson home, looking for clues, while volunteers began gathering in droves to assist. Sharon stood outside, clutching a picture of Laci. Her voice cracked as she described her daughter to the officers. "She's 27 years old, 8 months pregnant. She wouldn't just leave. She was so excited about Christmas, about Connor. Something's happened to her, I can feel it." Inside, Scott Peterson was calm, eerily so. While Sharon trembled with worry, Scott recounted his story to the detectives in a measured tone. "I went fishing at Berkeley Marina early this morning. When I came back, she was gone." His gaze didn't falter, but his words lacked the urgency one would expect from a husband whose pregnant wife was missing. Detective Al Brocchini, one of the lead investigators, took note of Scott's demeanor. "You're sure Laci didn't mention going anywhere?" he asked, watching Scott closely. "No," Scott replied. "She was going to walk the dog and then run errands. That's all I know." The town rallied quickly. Flyers with Laci's smiling face plastered streetlights, shop windows, and telephone poles. Search parties combed through parks, fields, and backyards. Local news channels broadcast the story relentlessly, urging anyone with information to come forward. Strangers offered their support, while friends and neighbors shared memories of Laci, describing her as kind-hearted and full of life. But amid the community's outpouring of concern, whispers of doubt began to surface about Scott's behavior. At the first vigil held for Laci, he stood apart from the crowd, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Friends noticed how he avoided eye contact and seemed disengaged, even as Sharon wept openly while speaking to the gathered crowd. "He's acting like this is just an inconvenience," one neighbor muttered under their breath. "It's not normal." Adding to the unease, police found inconsistencies in Scott's account of his day. His timeline of the fishing trip didn't align with witnesses at Berkeley Marina. There were also questions about his decision to go fishing on Christmas Eve, a choice that seemed odd given the family's holiday plans. Back at the Peterson home, detectives noticed something unusual in the couple's bedroom. Laci's purse, keys, and wallet were untouched, neatly placed where she always kept them. It was as if she had never left the house that morning. "If she went out," one officer remarked, "why wouldn't she take these with her?" As search efforts intensified, Scott's behavior continued to draw scrutiny. When asked to assist in the search, he declined, citing exhaustion. Instead, he stayed home or made himself scarce, avoiding the reporters who now lined the street outside. His reluctance to engage left even those closest to him questioning his actions. At the end of the day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sharon sat on the porch, clutching her phone and staring into the distance. "Laci," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Where are you?" Modesto was no longer the peaceful town it had been just a day ago. A pall of fear and suspicion hung over its streets, and the search for Laci was quickly becoming a race against time. Amber Frey stared at the television screen, frozen. The man on the news, the one surrounded by a flurry of reporters outside a modest suburban home in Modesto, was Scott Peterson. The same Scott Peterson who had taken her out to dinner just weeks ago, who had told her he was single and searching for a fresh start. Her heart pounded as the anchor's words registered fully. Scott Peterson, husband of Laci Peterson, who is 8 months pregnant, has reported her missing on Christmas Eve. The room seemed to close in on her as she rewound the last month in her mind. The intimate conversations, the promises he made, the moments they shared. Each memory now felt like a shard of glass pressing against her chest. Amber grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. "I need to call the police," she whispered to herself, steeling her resolve. Within the hour, she was speaking to Detective Al Brocchini, recounting every detail of her relationship with Scott. "I didn't know he was married," she explained, her voice breaking. "He told me his wife had passed away." Detective Brocchini's expression remained neutral, but inwardly, he knew this was a pivotal moment in the investigation. Amber's testimony confirmed suspicions that Scott had been living a double life. "Would you be willing to record your phone calls with him?" he asked carefully. Amber hesitated, then nodded. "If it helps find Laci, I'll do whatever it takes." That night, Amber called Scott. Her voice was steady, but her heart raced as she pressed him for answers. "Scott," she said, her tone laced with concern, "I saw the news today. Your wife is missing. What's going on?" On the other end of the line, Scott's voice was calm, too calm. "Yeah," he replied, his words deliberate. "I didn't tell you earlier because I didn't want you to worry. It's been really hard. This is the first Christmas since she's been gone." Amber froze, her stomach twisting. "Since she's been gone?" she repeated, incredulous. "Scott, what do you mean? She just went missing." There was a brief silence before Scott responded. "I meant, it's just been hard dealing with everything." His attempt to backtrack was feeble, and Amber felt the weight of his deception crashing down on her. The next morning, Amber met with investigators, handing over the recording. The gravity of her involvement hit her as she watched their reactions. Brocchini leaned forward, his tone serious. "This changes everything. We need to act fast." As the recording was analyzed, it became clear that Scott wasn't just a grieving husband. His casual tone, his attempts to manipulate Amber's perception, these were not the actions of someone desperate to find his missing wife. Meanwhile, Amber wrestled with her guilt. She had trusted Scott, believed in the story he spun so convincingly. Now she felt complicit in a tragedy she didn't fully understand. "I didn't know," she whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know." By the end of the day, the investigation had shifted gears. The picture of Scott as a devoted husband was beginning to unravel, replaced by something far darker. The revelations from Amber Frey were a turning point, casting a shadow over Scott's every word and action. And for Amber, the nightmare was just beginning. The investigation into Laci Peterson's disappearance was picking up speed, and Scott Peterson's alibi was beginning to crumble under scrutiny. Detectives had already noted inconsistencies in his timeline, but as they dug deeper, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Detective Al Brocchini sat in his office reviewing Scott's initial statement. "I left for Berkeley Marina around 9 a.m., Scott had claimed. But receipts from a gas station near the marina showed a different story, one that placed him there much later than he had admitted. Brocchini leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Scott was lying about the timing, what else was he hiding? Meanwhile, investigators focused their efforts on Scott's boat, a detail he had downplayed during his interviews. The small fishing boat was new, purchased just weeks before Laci's disappearance. On board, they found a single concrete anchor, crudely made, along with traces of dirt and debris that didn't belong. Forensic experts began analyzing these materials, suspecting they might hold critical clues. But it wasn't just physical evidence raising questions. Witnesses at Berkeley Marina recalled seeing Scott the morning of December 24th, acting strangely. He looked nervous, one dock worker reported, kept looking around like he was worried someone might be watching. Back in Modesto, Sharon Rocha was growing increasingly frustrated with Scott's evasive behavior. During one tense conversation, she pressed him for details. "Scott, what exactly did you do that morning?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "I told you," Scott replied, his tone flat. "I went fishing. I thought it would be a good way to clear my head." Sharon's eyes narrowed. "Clear your head? Laci was 8 months pregnant, Scott. You really thought fishing was a priority?" Scott said nothing, his jaw tightening. For Sharon, it was another red flag, a confirmation of the growing doubts she couldn't shake. As the days passed, Scott's behavior became increasingly erratic. Detectives noted that he seemed more focused on maintaining his image than finding Laci. At a press conference organized by the family, Scott stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, avoiding eye contact with reporters. His distant demeanor was impossible to ignore, sparking murmurs among the attendees. The media began to seize on the inconsistencies, too. Local news stations aired footage of Scott's interviews, dissecting his words and body language. "He doesn't look like a grieving husband," one anchor remarked. "He looks like someone hiding something." Then came the discovery of Scott's internet search history. Investigators uncovered searches for tide patterns in San Francisco Bay, data that aligned disturbingly with the location of Berkeley Marina. Forensic experts confirmed the searches were made in the weeks leading up to Laci's disappearance. By now, the public was turning against Scott. Social media buzzed with theories, many pointing to his affair with Amber Frey as a possible motive. Amber, who had continued cooperating with the police, felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. "I trusted him," she confided to a friend, "and now I don't even know who he is." As each new piece of evidence came to light, the walls around Scott began to close in. His alibi, once so carefully constructed, was falling apart. And for investigators, it was only a matter of time before the truth would be revealed. The Peterson case had begun as a local tragedy, but within weeks it exploded into a national spectacle. News vans lined the quiet streets of Modesto, their satellite dishes towering over the modest homes. Reporters jostled for position outside the Peterson house, shouting questions at Scott whenever he ventured outdoors. "Scott, do you have any updates on Laci's whereabouts? Do you believe your wife was abducted? What about the allegations of an affair?" Scott's responses, when he bothered to answer, were brief and devoid of emotion. "We're hopeful for her safe return," he said in one televised interview, his voice flat. But his hollow demeanor only fueled public speculation. Across the nation, viewers tuned in, dissecting his every word and gesture. Was this a man grieving his missing wife, or someone hiding a dark secret? Amber Frey's revelation had poured gasoline on the fire. Her press conference was a bombshell, with cameras capturing every tearful word. "I was deceived by Scott Peterson," she declared, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he was married. I didn't know about Laci." The footage was replayed endlessly on news channels, painting Scott as a manipulative liar. Sharon Rocha, however, was undeterred by the media circus. "This isn't about Scott," she told reporters one evening, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "This is about finding my daughter. Please, help us bring her home." Her plea struck a chord with the public, who rallied around her. Vigils for Laci were held across the country, candles flickering in the hands of strangers who had never met her but felt compelled to show their support. Behind the scenes, detectives worked tirelessly, sifting through the tips pouring in from the public. Some were outlandish, claims of UFO sightings or secret cults. But one lead caught their attention. A dock worker at Berkeley Marina had seen Scott on the morning of December 24th, acting nervously as he prepared his boat. "He didn't look like he was going fishing," the man told police. "More like he was trying to get rid of something." Scott's actions continued to raise eyebrows. He avoided community searches for Laci, citing exhaustion, and refused to participate in media appeals for information. "Why won't he just beg for her safe return?" one anchor asked during a primetime broadcast. The question hung in the air, echoing the sentiments of millions watching at home. In Modesto, the tension was palpable. Neighbors whispered about Scott's strange behavior, while friends of Laci struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the man now being vilified on television. Even those closest to him were beginning to doubt. "Something doesn't add up," a family friend confided to a reporter. "Scott's not acting like an innocent man." For Scott, the walls were closing in. Every day brought new headlines, new allegations. His private life was now public property, his secrets laid bare for the world to see. And yet he remained steadfastly silent about one thing: what really happened to Laci. The media frenzy was relentless, and as pressure mounted, the case took on a life of its own, a gripping, tragic saga that would captivate the nation for months to come. April 13th, 2003, began like any other foggy spring morning in the San Francisco Bay Area. Fishermen prepared their boats, and joggers traced familiar paths along the shoreline. But as the tide shifted that day, it unearthed something horrifying, a discovery that would forever alter the Peterson case. It started with the call to the Richmond Police Department. A passerby reported seeing what looked like a human body tangled in the reeds near the bay's edge. Officers arrived swiftly, their faces hardening as they took in the scene. The remains were severely decomposed, almost unrecognizable, but the presence of small skeletal structures nearby left no doubt. This was a pregnant woman and her unborn child. Detective Al Brocchini was immediately notified. The discovery was just miles from Berkeley Marina, the very location Scott Peterson had listed as his alibi. Forensic teams were dispatched to the scene, working meticulously to preserve every fragment of evidence. As they examined the remains, one chilling detail stood out: the way the bodies had been tethered with crude makeshift weights. It was clear this was no accident. News of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, reporters had converged on the marina, their cameras capturing the grim retrieval of evidence from the water. At home in Modesto, Sharon Rocha's phone rang. It was the call she had both dreaded and anticipated. "Sharon," the officer said gently, "we've found a body. We can't confirm anything yet, but we think it might be Laci." Sharon collapsed onto the couch, her hands trembling. "No, no, no," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Not my baby." Her family gathered around her, offering comfort. But the weight of the moment was too much to bear. The hope they had clung to for months was slipping away. Meanwhile, Scott Peterson's reaction was once again uncharacteristic. When police arrived at his doorstep to inform him of the discovery, he appeared unfazed. "Okay," he said simply, his tone devoid of shock or grief. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances. It was a moment that would later haunt them, solidifying their belief in his guilt. As the forensic analysis progressed, confirmation came swiftly. The bodies were identified as Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The medical examiner determined that the remains had been in the water for months, consistent with the timeline of Laci's disappearance. But the exact cause of death remained elusive, a haunting mystery that left investigators with more questions than answers. The public's response was immediate and visceral. Candlelight vigils were replaced by cries for justice. Across the nation, people mourned for Laci and Connor, their lives cut short in an act of unimaginable cruelty. And yet, amid the collective grief, a darker sentiment emerged: outrage toward Scott. He was no longer just a suspect. He was the villain of a story that had captivated the world. For law enforcement, the discovery was both a breakthrough and a burden. The physical evidence tied the case to Berkeley Marina, but it was circumstantial, requiring careful presentation in court. Brocchini knew the stakes. "This is it," he told his team. "We have what we need. Now we just have to make it stick." That evening, Scott sat alone in his Modesto home, the glow of the television flickering across his face. The news anchor's voice was somber as she relayed the day's events, but Scott showed no reaction. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. As the bay grew quiet once more, its secrets revealed, The Peterson case was catapulted into its next chapter, a pursuit of justice that promised to expose every lie Scott had worked so hard to conceal. April 18, 2003. The streets of Modesto were unusually quiet that morning, but the tension was palpable within the police department. Detective Al Brocchini had been up all night, reviewing the case file. The discovery of Laci and Connor's remains had propelled their investigation into overdrive, leaving no room for error. Today, they would make their move. Scott Peterson's behavior since the discovery had been nothing short of bizarre. He'd shown no outward signs of grief, avoided calls from Laci's family, and appeared almost aloof in public. But it was his sudden disappearance from Modesto that raised immediate red flags. When detectives learned he was in San Diego, they knew they had to act fast. By mid-morning, Brocchini and his team tracked Scott to a golf course parking lot near Torrey Pines. The tip had come from a plainclothes officer tailing Scott for days. As they approached his car, they noticed he was sitting in the driver's seat, staring blankly out the windshield. His appearance had changed dramatically. His hair was dyed a brassy blonde, and he had grown a scruffy beard. "Scott Peterson," Brocchini called out, his voice steady. Scott turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle." Scott complied without resistance, his hands raised slightly as if to suggest he had nothing to hide. But the contents of his car told a different story. As officers searched the vehicle, they uncovered a disturbing collection of items: $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, camping gear, a stash of protein bars, and his brother's driver's license. A map of Mexico was folded neatly in the glove compartment. "What were you planning, Scott?" Brocchini asked as they cuffed him. Scott didn't respond, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. The silence spoke volumes. The news of Scott's arrest spread like wildfire, reigniting the media frenzy that had barely subsided since Laci's disappearance. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras flashing as Scott was escorted into custody. Headlines across the country blared, "Scott Peterson arrested. Evidence suggests escape plan." Back in Modesto, Sharon Rocha was informed of the arrest. Her reaction was a mix of relief and anguish. "I want justice for Laci and Connor," she said during an impromptu press conference, "but nothing can bring them back." In custody, Scott maintained his innocence. "I didn't do anything," he told his attorney. But the evidence against him was mounting. The crude anchors found in his garage matched the weights suspected of being used to submerge Laci's body. His internet search history revealed chilling inquiries about water currents and body decomposition. As Scott sat in his cell that evening, the weight of the situation began to sink in. For months he had spun a web of lies, but now the truth was catching up to him. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he seemed to realize there was no way out. The arrest marked a turning point, not just for the investigation, but for everyone touched by the tragedy. For Sharon, it was a step closer to closure. For the detectives, it was validation of their relentless pursuit of justice. And for Scott, it was the beginning of the end. June 1st, 2004. The San Mateo County Courthouse buzzed with anticipation as one of the most sensational trials in American history began. Journalists filled every available seat, their pens poised, while others camped outside, eager to capture the frenzy. The world watched as Scott Peterson, charged with the murders of his wife, Laci, and their unborn son, Connor, faced a jury of his peers. Scott entered the courtroom dressed sharply in a dark suit, his face impassive. To some, he looked every bit the wrongfully accused. To others, his stoic demeanor only reinforced their belief in his guilt. Sharon Rocha sat in the gallery, clutching a photo of Laci and Connor, her grief palpable. Across the aisle, Scott's family maintained a united front, their expressions strained as they silently supported him. The prosecution wasted no time painting Scott as a calculated killer who viewed his wife and unborn child as obstacles. He wanted freedom, Prosecutor Rick DiStasso declared in his opening statement, his voice unwavering. Freedom to be with Amber Frey, freedom to escape the responsibilities of fatherhood, and he was willing to kill for it. Jurors listened intently as DiStasso laid out the evidence, the internet searches for tide patterns, the concrete anchors, the inconsistencies in Scott's alibi. Each detail was meticulously woven into a narrative that portrayed Scott as a man who had meticulously planned his crimes and attempted to cover his tracks. Then came the defense's turn. Mark Garagos, a seasoned attorney known for defending high-profile clients, argued that Scott was being unfairly vilified. "This case is built on circumstantial evidence," Garagos emphasized. "There is no direct proof tying my client to Laci's death, no fingerprints, no DNA, just assumptions." But it was Amber Frey's testimony that truly captured the courtroom's attention. Amber, visibly nervous but determined, recounted her relationship with Scott in vivid detail. She spoke of how he had assured her he was single, how he had lied about Laci's death, and how she had come to realize the horrifying truth. "I trusted him," she said, her voice cracking, "and he betrayed me, just like he betrayed Laci." Her recorded phone calls with Scott were played for the jury, each word laced with deception. In one call, Scott spoke calmly about his future with Amber while the search for Laci intensified. The contrast was chilling. Jurors glanced at each other, their expressions grim. As the trial progressed, the prosecution introduced more damning evidence. Fibers from Laci's clothing found on Scott's boat, the GPS data placing him at Berkeley Marina, and eyewitness accounts of his behavior in the days following her disappearance. Each piece added weight to the case against him. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs demanding justice for Laci and Connor. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of grief and anger. Reporters delivered hourly updates, their broadcasts dissecting every moment of the trial. Inside, Scott remained unflinching, his expression unreadable. But for the jurors, the narrative was becoming clearer with each passing day. This was no grieving husband. This was a man with secrets, a man who had spun a web of lies and now stood trapped within it. As the trial drew to a close, the courtroom fell silent. Closing arguments loomed, and the fate of Scott Peterson and the legacy of Laci and Connor hung in the balance. The courtroom was hushed as the prosecution introduced the pivotal forensic evidence. This was the moment the jury had been waiting for, the hard science that would bridge the circumstantial narrative with irrefutable proof. Forensic pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson took the stand, his composed demeanor reinforcing the gravity of his testimony. Dr. Peterson began with the autopsy findings of Laci and Connor. The remains, he explained, had been in the water for months, severely decomposed and damaged by marine activity. However, the positioning of the bodies told a grim story. "The manner in which they were found," he said, his voice steady but somber, "suggests they were weighed down intentionally with the purpose of concealing them." Jurors leaned forward as the prosecution displayed photos of the anchors found in Scott Peterson's garage. Their crude construction, hand-poured concrete molded in circular forms, matched impressions found on the remnants of Laci's clothing. These details were methodically laid out, each one tightening the noose around Scott's claims of innocence. But the evidence didn't stop there. Fibers collected from Scott's fishing boat were revealed to have come from a jacket Laci was known to wear frequently. DNA analysis confirmed the match. "There is no way these fibers could have been transferred naturally," the prosecution argued. "They were deposited there because Laci was on that boat." Detectives also presented data from Scott's GPS device. On December 24th, the day Laci vanished, his movements traced a direct path to Berkeley Marina, consistent with his own admission. However, what he had failed to account for was the tide data he had previously searched online. This information, retrieved from his computer, outlined specific tidal patterns for the bay, information investigators believed he used to plan where to dispose of the bodies. Scott's defense team, led by Mark Garagos, tried to dismantle the forensic case. Garagos pointed out that there was no direct evidence placing Scott at the scene of the crime when Laci died. "No fingerprints, no blood, just theories," he stated, pacing in front of the jury. "This evidence doesn't prove murder. It proves a desperate attempt to pin a tragedy on an innocent man." But the prosecution anticipated this argument. They introduced a bombshell, receipts showing Scott's purchase of concrete mix just days before Laci's disappearance. Combined with the anchors, the fiber evidence, and the GPS data, the narrative became undeniable. Scott Peterson wasn't an innocent man caught in an unfortunate situation. He was a husband who had meticulously planned and executed a crime to free himself from a life he no longer wanted. Sharon Rocha watched from the gallery, tears streaming down her face as the forensic evidence was presented. She gripped a small pendant around her neck, a locket containing a picture of Laci and Connor. The weight of the testimony was unbearable, but it also brought her a grim sense of validation. "This," she whispered to herself, "is how they'll get justice." As the prosecution rested their case, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The evidence was compelling, but the defense's narrative of circumstantial doubt still lingered. For the jury, the weight of the decision was monumental. They held not just Scott's fate in their hands, but also the legacy of Laci and Connor, a truth that demanded justice. November 12, 2004. The courtroom was filled with a suffocating tension as the jury filed in, their expressions stoic. The nation held its breath, waiting for the verdict in a case that had gripped the country for months. Scott Peterson sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, while his attorney, Mark Garagos, leaned in to offer final words of reassurance. Judge Alfred A. DeLucchi addressed the jury foreman. "Have you reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of what was about to unfold. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, handing over the slip of paper. The judge read it silently before passing it to the clerk. Moments later, the verdict was read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Scott Lee Peterson, guilty of the first-degree murder of Laci Peterson and guilty of the second-degree murder of Connor Peterson." Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by an eerie silence. Sharon Rocha clutched the hands of her family members, tears streaming down her face. Relief mingled with sorrow as she closed her eyes, murmuring, "Justice for Laci, justice for Connor." Across the aisle, Scott's family sat stunned, their faces pale and filled with disbelief. Scott himself remained expressionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. It was as if the reality of the moment hadn't registered, or he refused to let it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Supporters of Laci's family cheered and wept, waving signs demanding justice. The media descended in a frenzy, cameras capturing every emotional reaction. The Peterson case had been a saga of heartbreak and deceit, and now it had reached its climax. Back inside, Judge DeLucchi addressed the jury once more. "The next phase of this trial will determine the penalty," he announced. For Sharon, the verdict was only part of the justice she sought. "He took everything from us," she later told reporters. "Now it's his turn to face the consequences." The penalty phase began days later, with the prosecution calling on Sharon Rocha to deliver a victim impact statement. Standing before the court, she held a photo of Laci and Connor close to her chest. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My daughter was kind, loving, and full of life," Sharon said. "She was so excited to be a mother. And Connor, he never even got the chance to take his first breath. Scott stole that from them, and from us." The jury deliberated once more, this time deciding whether Scott should receive life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution argued that his calculated actions and lack of remorse warranted the harshest punishment. The defense pleaded for leniency, painting Scott as a man who had been vilified without concrete evidence. Ultimately, the jury returned with their decision. "We recommend the death penalty for Scott Lee Peterson," the foreman declared. As the sentence was read, Scott's gaze remained fixed ahead, his expression unchanged. For Sharon and Laci's family, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Laci and Connor back. The chapter on Scott Peterson's guilt had closed, but the legacy of his actions and the lives he destroyed would echo for years to come. March 16, 2005. The courtroom was packed once again as Scott Peterson's death sentence was officially handed down. Judge Alfred A. DeLucchi's voice cut through the heavy silence. "For the first-degree murder of Laci Peterson, you are sentenced to death. For the second-degree murder of Connor Peterson, you are sentenced to 15 years to life, to run concurrently." The air in the room felt electric, charged with emotions that had been building for years. Sharon Rocha's grip on her son Brent's hand tightened as the judge's words landed. Her face remained composed, but her eyes brimmed with tears. justice had been served, yet the emptiness left by Laci and Connor was as palpable as ever. Outside the courthouse, a sea of supporters cheered the announcement. Signs reading "Justice for Laci and Connor" were held high as cameras captured the moment. Reporters scrambled to deliver the breaking news, their voices filled with urgency. Scott Peterson has been sentenced to death, marking the end of one of the most high-profile cases in recent history. Meanwhile, Scott was escorted back to his cell, his expression as inscrutable as it had been throughout the trial. For months, he had maintained his innocence, despite the mountain of evidence against him. To his supporters, he was a man wrongfully convicted. To the majority of the public, he was a cold-blooded killer who had finally faced the consequences of his actions. The days that followed were bittersweet for Sharon. She spoke to the media with poise, her voice steady but laden with emotion. "I am relieved that justice has been done," she said, clutching a framed photo of Laci and Connor. "But nothing can fill the void they left behind. My daughter and grandson deserved so much more. They deserved life." In Modesto, the Peterson house stood as a haunting reminder of the tragedy. The Christmas decorations Laci had lovingly placed were long gone, replaced by silence and overgrown weeds. Neighbors still spoke of her kindness and the heartbreak of losing her so violently. Scott's sentence marked the end of the legal battle, but the story was far from over. Appeals were filed almost immediately, his legal team arguing procedural errors and insufficient evidence. Yet for Sharon and her family, the verdict offered a semblance of closure. It was a chance to remember Laci and Connor for who they were, rather than how they were taken. Across the nation, the Peterson case left a lasting impact. It sparked debates about the death penalty, media sensationalism, and the fragility of trust within families. Memorial funds were established in Laci and Connor's names, supporting causes they would have cherished. As Scott awaited his fate on death row, Sharon visited Laci and Connor's graves, her hand resting gently on the headstone. "We did it," she whispered. "You have justice now." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for the first time in months there was a faint sense of peace. In the years that followed, the Peterson case remained a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary facades. And for those who loved Laci and Connor, their memories became a source of strength, a beacon of light in the shadow of an unthinkable tragedy. The story of Laci and Connor Peterson did not end with Scott's conviction. Their names became a symbol of innocence lost and a rallying cry for justice. In Modesto, Laci's memory lived on, woven into the fabric of the community she had loved so dearly. Sharon Rocha took the pain of her loss and turned it into purpose. She became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at events and lending her voice to causes that aimed to prevent tragedies like the one that claimed her daughter and grandson. If sharing Laci's story can save even one life, then her death was not in vain, she often said, her words resonating with families across the nation. The Peterson case also sparked legislative changes. In 2004, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, informally known as Laci and Connor's Law, was passed. The law recognized unborn children as separate victims if they were harmed or killed during the commission of a federal crime. For Sharon, it was a bittersweet victory. "This is for Connor," she said during the signing ceremony. "He may never have taken his first breath, but his life mattered." Across the country, the media dissected the case, turning it into a cautionary tale about trust and deception. Documentaries, books, and countless news specials sought to understand how a man like Scott could betray the people closest to him. Public fascination with the case remained strong, but for those who knew Laci, it was her life, not her death, that deserved to be remembered. Laci's friends often spoke of her warmth and generosity. "She was the kind of person who made you feel special," one close friend said during a memorial. "She had this way of lighting up a room. We'll never forget her smile." These memories fueled annual gatherings in Modesto, where people shared stories about Laci and Connor, ensuring their legacy endured. For Scott, the years on death row were a stark contrast to the life he had once envisioned. His appeals dragged on, each one reopening wounds for Laci's family. Yet through it all, Sharon remained steadfast. "He may live behind bars, but he will never escape what he did," she said firmly. "That's his prison." The Peterson case also left a profound impact on law enforcement. Detectives like Al Brocchini reflected on the challenges of building a case that was largely circumstantial. "It was one of the hardest investigations of my career," he admitted, "but it was worth every sleepless night to get justice for Laci and Connor." As the years passed, Laci and Connor's story became a part of America's collective memory, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of seeking truth, no matter how painful. For Sharon and her family, healing came slowly, but it did come. They found solace in honoring Laci's dreams, establishing scholarships in her name and supporting causes she cared about. On what would have been Connor's 18th birthday, Sharon visited the gravesite, placing a single white rose on the headstone. The air was quiet, the sun casting a warm glow over the peaceful scene. "You're still with us," she whispered. "Both of you are." And with that, the legacy of Laci and Connor carried on, not just as victims of a horrific crime, but as symbols of resilience, love, and the enduring power of justice. What do you think of Scott Peterson and his actions throughout this tragic case? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling true crime stories.